This is Autoline This Week, the show that gets you inside the global automotive industry. Autoline This Week partnered with the Consulate General of Canada in Detroit to produce this episode.
Hello, and thanks for joining us on Autoline This Week. Today's discussion is all about electric cars, yet again, but from a different standpoint. Today, we're going to look at the legal issues that are coming in that maybe the auto industry hasn't faced before, or their suppliers, or even the electric utilities. And joining me for the conversation today include Jennifer Dukarski, an attorney with Butzel Long, the law firm. Also, we've got Sam Abuelsamid, Associate Director at Guidehouse. Great having the two of you here to talk about this. And Jennifer, I'm going to kick it off with a very simple question. Is it true? I mean, are electric cars going to bring a whole lot more legal issues the industry's never had to deal with before?
Well, I'll put it this way. I think it's going to bring a host of new legal issues that are similar but different than the ones we have today. And really, it roots itself in some of the complexity. What we have with EVs is a system that has the opportunity to interface with so many more technologies. Whether you're plugging in at home, you're plugging in on the road, these types of connectivity issues and connecting with outside sources is something that really we don't see unless we're plugging in to get a vehicle diagnostic done. So it's going to open up new avenues that way. But all the same, it's really complex technology that is just going to make the complexity ramp up at an exponential level.
Sam, how do you see it?
I agree with Jennifer. We've certainly got some new technology issues that are going to have to be dealt with, such as the liability issues around batteries, with particularly fires. We've seen some real issues pop up recently with the Chevy Bolt, and there's been issues with other vehicles as well. But I agree that I think where some of the new things are going to be around connectivity, especially when you get into areas like managing charging. Remote management of charging is going to be an interesting one. Utilities obviously would like to get much more involved in that process of being able to turn on and off charging for people so that they can manage the load on the grid. That may lead to some interesting issues for customers that suddenly find that they wake up in the morning and unplug their car and it hasn't been charged for whatever reason. So there's that complexity is going to play itself out in a lot of different ways, I think.
Let's dive into battery fires with electric cars right now, because it's so much in the headlines. Jennifer, how do you evaluate this, from a legal standpoint? You've got General Motors blaming its supplier. Its supplier doesn't want to blame its customer. And meanwhile, customers, people who have bought the car are being told, don't park it in your garage. It might burn your house down. Don't even park it within 50 feet of another vehicle. This just seems to be an invitation to all kinds of lawsuits.
Well, as a consumer, I would absolutely hear that message. And depending on how sophisticated you are, just the fear of, I can't park my car in the garage. I can't park it near anything else. Where am I going to park? Down the street? What if I live in a big city? There's nowhere to park. I think that fear really creates a situation where we do have to be on our toes from consumers arguing either in the case of a fire where there is a lawsuit, or even in kind of risking a diminution of value, that the vehicle itself is worth less than when they bought it, just because of those risks and the fact that you can't use it like you would a traditional vehicle. That being said, let's pivot for a second to kind of the blame game and who is responsible. I think there's a big question there, because really it's not just the battery itself. It's not just the vehicle itself, but there is so much to the architecture that really understanding each individual issue, whether it's the Chevy issue or any other battery issue, you really have to understand the full complexity of the architecture. Because when a supplier goes into a relationship with their customer, they don't always have all of the facts. And likewise, the OEMs, the Ford, the GMs, they may not know everything either that's going on the supply side. So really, there's a lot of opportunity for improved communications and improved understanding. But it's one thing that it's really hard to blame one side or the other right off the tick without a lot of investigation.
Sam, how do you think this is going to be resolved between GM and LG Chem, which made the batteries that go into the Chevy Bolt that are causing these fires. GM says it's identified a couple of manufacturing defects, but even if it turns out this is all LG's fault and GM hands it the bill, which it now says could be $1.8 billion, I mean, something like this could cripple a supplier. What do they do? I mean, do they have insurance, or how do they get around this, or do you even know?
Yeah, well, for a supplier like LG, they're part of a much larger conglomerate, the LG Group, that is involved in a wide variety of businesses. So I don't think that LG specifically is going to be crippled by paying a $5 or $2 billion bill, or up to $2 billion bill to replace these batteries. But for some other companies, that certainly could be an issue. I mean, it's always been, or at least for a long time, part of the way the auto industry works is that if there is a defect that requires a recall or some sort of warranty work, if it's a defect that was caused by an issue from the supplier usually picks up a big chunk of that bill. In this case, following up on what Jennifer was saying about complexity, there's more to it than just the cells. Yes, they seem to have identified a manufacturing issue with the cells, but there's also other aspects of this. You also have the design of the battery pack itself that the cells are integrated into. There's the battery management system that manages the output from all the modules within the pack and transferring power back and forth between the battery and the rest of the vehicle. And and Jennifer can probably answer this better than I can in terms of liability, but it seems like there's the potential of someone were to sue GM. Is GM partly responsible because perhaps they didn't design a battery management system, or they didn't design the pack in a way that it was resistant to these fires? So yeah, LG may be the root cause because of the manufacturing defect of the cells, but there's a lot of other pieces that may have potentially been able to mitigate the problem.
So Jennifer, let's talk about that culpability for liability. What do you think is going to happen between LG and General Motors? And what lessons can other automakers and battery suppliers take from this case?
Well, I think ultimately you're getting into a situation where there's going to be a real difficult time establishing firmly the full perspective of what's to blame. As Sam mentioned, there are some issues that are potentially manufacturing related within the cells. How much of that truly contributed to the ultimate problem? Other issues, as Sam mentioned, with the architecture, you're dealing with a situation where there's likely a kind of a mutual culpability. There are knowns, there are unknowns that went into the design. So I think naturally GM is going to want LG to pick up as much as humanly possible. Likewise, LG really wants the full perspective to be understood, that it isn't necessarily only these manufacturing defects that went into causing the issue. So likely you'll either end up in court, or more likely probably some form of arbitration, really kind of a closed universe, which you'll find a lot of suppliers and OEMs going into to try to deal with these issues, hammer it out, and find a resolution. So I think you'll find what will likely happen is some form of arbitration. The number will be between 0 and very big, and they'll end up, nobody will ever necessarily know, because it most likely won't be public.
And are there lessons to be learned for others, or is this just stuff that happens when you make cars?
Well, I think the answer is yes and yes. First off, any manufacturing defect and things like that are just normal parts of the process. Understanding that things will happen, the supply chain has its limitations, responding to that in a very quick way, making sure that you're able to quickly isolate what vehicles could potentially have the issue. That's almost kind of normal block and tackle for the industry. So kind of expanding beyond that, I think for anyone who's going into the EV market, those specifications couldn't be more critical. That and a full understanding of what the system architecture looks like, understanding battery management, understanding all of those things that Sam mentioned earlier. If you're a supplier, some level of transparency from the customer side is going to be absolutely necessary to avoid some of these potential problems that have complex or really unknown root causes. The more that you know, the more that you're able to understand the environment you're in, the better you'll be able to design. And worst case scenario, if something does go wrong, you'll be able to respond more quickly and limit the scope of the problem.
Yeah,
Okay.
one of the things
Go
that
ahead,
been done in the auto industry over the last several decades is implementing quality processes. That the goal of that is to try to catch issues as early in the process as you can. And I mean, this actually, goes back to the 1950s, the work of J. Edward Deming and others, trying to catch those issues early on and address those. You don't want these things lingering in your process. The challenge here with these cells has been that it's such an infrequent occurrence. Even though we're in the case of the Bolt, I think we're talking right now about 8 fires that have occurred in that fleet of 140,000 vehicles. And compared to the number of vehicle fires that happen with gasoline vehicles every year, the number in 2018 it was 212,000 fires in the United States. So the frequency is much less. So these problems are very difficult to find. But what they've got to do is figure out, as you scale up production of these batteries and EVs, how are we going to test? What processes can we put in place to catch these things before they get out into the field, or before you have a large number of them out in the field, and address that, fix the manufacturing process early on. Here in this case, this has apparently been happening since at least 2017, and they've only now started to really figure out what's going on.
And John, let me build off of that for a second from the legal side. Those documents, kind of the nuts and bolts of what we do in the industry, looking at the potential defect failure modes, looking at what we're doing to control those, our DFMEAs, PFMEAs, and control plans, those will absolutely be critical in any litigation or any arbitration that comes from any battery issue.
So in other words, DFMA, designed for manufacturing and assembly, if you have that process in place in your manufacturing operations and your design operations, that helps you in court?
Absolutely. The more detailed, the more attention that you pay, the more thoughtfulness you are in looking at any of those potential failure modes, whether it's a design failure mode or an actual production failure mode. When you're looking for what could go wrong and you've identified things, honestly, the biggest fear is you've identified a potential root cause, a potential failure mode that could happen. You've identified it to be critical, and you do absolutely nothing to fix it. So that's where some of the weakest links are, where court cases can be won and lost. So absolutely, I think that when you look at it, the manufacturing engineers, the design engineers, and the quality engineers are absolutely mission critical into making sure they do that right up front, and that can have major legal consequences later.
So in other words, if you can show to the court, look, we tried everything to prevent this problem, it happened anyway, you're way better off than just saying it happened.
Well, in a product liability suit, now there's different tests in different states, but one of the tests really looks at alternative designs. And if you have no really reasonable alternative designs that you can implement, if you could make it absolutely 100% safe, but it's going to cost $1 million per vehicle, that legally isn't necessarily a requirement. So identifying that you have tried different design efforts, and at least, if nothing else, recognizing that you have found that potential defect and you have tried things either in the process or in the design to try to alleviate and avoid it, trying to mitigate it, that's really absolutely just so important from a legal perspective.
Wow. Great advice for any engineers or even managers who are watching this right now. Let's move beyond the batteries and the cars themselves to the charging infrastructure. Sam, what kind of legal pitfalls do you see as electric cars have to go and use a totally new fueling system?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly going to be challenges with home charging infrastructure is one case. With the installation process, we need to make sure that things like building codes are followed and that these chargers are installed correctly by licensed electricians, that sort of thing. At the public charging level, there's always the potential, especially when you move into DC fast charging, the more power you're putting into the vehicle, that increases the risk of things going wrong. And so we need to make sure that that those systems, that charging infrastructure is safe, has been properly installed, it's controlled properly, and isn't overcharging the vehicles, because that could cause damage. So there's a wide variety of places, again, where things can potentially go wrong, or potentially, they could, these systems could be sabotaged, vandalized, that could cause some issues. Hopefully those sorts of things would be reasonably easy to detect and address, but there's still, these are all the just as with the design of the vehicle, you have to consider all of the things that could potentially happen and take all reasonable measures to try and address that and make sure that you mitigate it as much as you can.
We've got another issue here too, Jennifer. My understanding is how utilities are regulated varies very much from state to state. And right now we've got public charging stations, which are buying electricity from the utilities, which are highly regulated. But I don't believe the retailers, the chargers are that regulated. Is there potential issues here? Because I know, for example, the charging stations, at least in this area in Michigan where we live, cannot even sell electricity by the kilowatt hour. They sell it by a unit of time, let's say a half hour or something like that. What kind of legal issues do you see in the regulation of all this?
I mean, I just see a host of opportunity, to be honest with you. I look at it from the perspective that we have a blank slate. And you're right. Right now, we just are in a position where there isn't, there's not a lot of good policy at a local level or even at a state to state level. So I think there's going to be a big fight to try to step in to get that localized charging station level, kind of retail level regulation in place. But that's honestly also the potential for a lot of nightmare if we have states going on a state by state basis. Just imagine if you're wanting to set up charging stations around the country, and Ohio has one set of regulations, Michigan has another set, and dear goodness, don't even talk about Florida or Hawaii. They're completely different. So the fear of creating that patchwork is just one that I think is it's a frightening opportunity, but there's still a lot of opportunity to step into that place because there really is nothing there, John.
Wow.
Hey, John, just to follow up on that, one of the interesting areas that, referring to that patchwork, that where there's been an opportunity that we haven't been able to take advantage of yet is vehicle to grid integration. Early on in the adoption of EVs in the latter part of the 2000s, there was a lot of talk about doing V2G, but we haven't really been able to deploy it because of the fact that we've got something like 3,000 different utilities across the United States, and all have different systems. There haven't been standards. That's something that's in process now, but there haven't been standards for how vehicles communicate back and forth and feed power back and forth to do that bidirectional charging. And that's another potential area where things can go wrong if you try to deploy vehicle to grid integration and it doesn't work, or if a utility is relying on a certain number of vehicles to be available to balance the grid, what happens if they're not there, if they don't get plugged in or they don't have enough charge in the batteries? So that's still more layers of complexity in this whole mess.
Yeah, Jennifer, Sam raises a really good example there. As you know, there's demand charging. So, if all of a sudden you start using a lot more electricity, your rates can go up. There's this managed charging that Sam's been talking about, not just putting electricity into the battery of a car, but taking the electricity from the battery, plugging it back into the grid to help manage this situation. Who's going to decide it? Is it going to be regulators, or is it going to be the courts, or is it going to be both?
I think long term, the answer is probably it's going to be both. When you look historically at any type of kind of regulatory schemes, when we first kicked off, our friends at NHTSA, they tried to make a lot of rules right off the tap, and a lot of those were shut down. So I see the same trend happening here. We're going to have a lot of new regulation pushed at a local and possibly even some at a federal level to try to contain this. And immediately you're going to have pushback, whether it's pushback from the industry itself or it's pushback from consumer groups, or even pushback from somebody who doesn't like the idea of contributing to the greater good by having some of their battery life taken back from them. You're going to have something happen. You're going to have a lot of litigation. So we're going to have a preliminary set of regs. We're going to have challenges. So I look forward to the fact that these things are going to be unsettled for probably at least the next 5 to 10 years.
Wow, Sam, what's that do to EV adoption? It sounds like a lot of this conversion to EVs is going to be spent in court.
Some of it will. I think we're still so very early in the adoption curve that the impact on all the drivers out there and vehicle owners out there right now is still extremely small. I mean, we're talking, still barely 2% of vehicles are sold in the U.S. are plug-ins. That's going to grow, but out of the total vehicle fleet of roughly 290 million vehicles registered in the U.S., we've got about less than 2 million of those are plug-in vehicles. So we're just getting started. By the time that we start to see a critical mass of EVs on the road, hopefully we will have worked through some of these issues and started to resolve them and get some alignment across the different stakeholders.
There's so many issues that we can talk on here, but I want to go back to batteries for a minute too. And Jennifer, there's got to be intellectual property issues surrounding battery design as automakers work with suppliers and vice versa, and those suppliers work with yet other automakers too. I got to believe that you're looking forward to litigating this as well.
Intellectual property is a perennial issue, and I think this is even more so with some of these technologies, and the fact that the companies developing them are really not necessarily your traditional, they're not your traditional widget suppliers, right? We have a lot of interesting formulation. There's a lot of chemistry involved to a degree. There's a lot of kind of connectivity issues involved. So you have a novel set of areas of patent law that you're dealing with when people actually get intellectual property protections in this area. And it's not just the patentable things. It's also, there's also a reliance to a degree on certain code programming and kind of the integration of the whole vehicle itself. So that's just an area that is exploding. And I'll give you kind of an anecdote that I've heard recently, John. A lot of the automakers are changing their terms and conditions, not only with respect to intellectual property, but also with respect to software. There are some that really never even had terms and conditions dealing with the software aspect. So any of the control mechanisms, they were lightly protected. So I think from that standpoint, you now have a host of new opportunities to challenge, because those software intellectual property provisions are to a degree far more draconian than just simply, who owns the flywheel or who owns the fastener patent. It's going to be a nice, big, complex area. And I think you're right. I hate looking for legal ghosts under every rock, but this is going to be an area that could potentially be rife with challenge.
Wow, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that they were changing their terms and conditions with the contracts that they make suppliers sign. Very interesting when it comes to software, that is.
Hey, John,
yeah.
just to follow up on that quickly, and I think this may be part of the reason why we've been seeing a lot of automakers over the past year or so really shift towards bringing more of the control of the software in-house. Instead, for a long time, they've been relying on suppliers to provide little bits and pieces of software for each feature that they supply. But now we're seeing a shift towards taking more control, doing more of that software internally and integrating that software, maybe getting some pieces from suppliers, but having overall management of that in-house so that the OEM knows what's in there and they can perhaps deal with some of these issues and make sure that they're covered when something goes wrong.
That's very interesting because publicly, at least, they've been saying they want more control because we're going to a software-defined car and the like. But you guys are saying it's also got this IP protection behind it as well, this move that in the new terms and conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the software terms themselves. I mean, a lot of the OEMs who do have pre-existing software terms, they're 20-page documents just to start with as a base template. So for those who really haven't had anything in place, there's just a host of information that they're putting into their terms and conditions now. And intellectual property is really one of them. And not just actually who invented the code, but it's also protecting against code that's used, whether it's open source material, and particularly that terminology you may have heard before of copy left, making sure that when you have a piece of code in there, that there are no downstream requirements that you have to share it back with the rest of the world if it's open source. So that's why, as Sam says, bringing it back in gives an OEM a good modicum of control to make sure that they know what's in there and what rights they have and what rights are being granted.
Well, I know we've barely scratched the surface here of all the different legal issues that are going to arise with electric cars, the batteries that go in them, the software that defines them, the charging stations, the fight between the retailers and the electric utilities. I really like the fact that you guys covered so much in such a short amount of time here. I know there's a lot more that we're going to have to get into on another show, but Jennifer Dukarski from Butzel Long, Sam Abuelsamid from Guidehouse Insights, thank you for your information today.
Thank you, John.
Thanks for having us.
And of course, I want to thank all of you for having tuned in.
Autoline This Week partnered with the Consulate General of Canada in Detroit to produce this episode.